Okay, so I don't know why my screen keeps doing that now, but um, here we are at the last section of the sectional conflict material. And up to this point, we've talked about some of the things leading up to the 1850s that have been part of this ongoing question of what do we do with new territories and new states in terms of slavery expanding into those areas, and keep trying to find solutions, compromises that seemingly fix the problem for the long term, but in reality they don't. And so you've got things like the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. The next several events in the mid to late 1850s then are really going to push the nation closer and closer and closer to outright civil war. And one of those is an act that happens in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this is really the brainchild of Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas is doing this more for his own political gain than he is for anything else. And Douglas then will become something of a pariah in American political history because of his sort of single-minded ambition. And rather than working for the benefit of the country, he decides to push this particular piece of legislation largely for his own interests. Basically, the Kansas-Nebraska Act says we're going to do away with the Missouri Compromise line entirely, right? We're going to get rid of that line that had originally defined where slave states and free states could come out of the Louisiana Territory, and we're going to replace it with what's known colloquially at the time as popular sovereignty or squatter sovereignty. Basically, this means that the people of a particular territory will be able to decide for themselves whether they want to be a free or a slave territory and a free or a slave state. On the face of it, this seems very democratic, and it seems very appropriate. In reality, though, this is going to be a serious, serious problem for a lot of different reasons. Partially, there's no way to know exactly what stage of the process of statehood this decision is going to be made. There's no indication whether this will be a one-time decision and then that will be permanent, whether this can be changed over time, lots of different things. Partially as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you see the emergence of a new political party, the Republican Party. Now, this is the Republican Party organizationally and structurally, if not ideologically. This is the Republican Party that we have today. So it emerges for the first time in 1854, and it becomes a fairly powerful force pretty quickly. Most third parties in American history don't have much success, and they certainly don't have much of a lifespan. But the Republican Party manages a fairly significant level of achievement initially, and then obviously, since it still exists today, clearly the party as an apparatus has survived. Partially, it absorbs the existing membership of other political entities, especially the Whig Party. We haven't talked about the Whig Party a lot, but suffice it to say that the Whig Party by the 1850s was really, really losing steam. And so the Republican Party ends up being a jumping off point for a lot of former Whigs, including Abraham Lincoln. And so this is going to help it sort of build its apparatus and build its membership a little bit faster than it would have been able to if it had just tried to come up from the ground up. Kansas is going to be the first sort of battleground, I guess you could say, over this question of popular sovereignty, this question of how the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to work. And a lot of Republicans who are more sort of devoted to the abolition side of things, because that's really one of the main centerpieces of the Republican Party, is abolition and anti-slavery. So some of the more radical Republicans, the more sort of assertive or aggressive Republicans, decide that they're going to travel to Kansas specifically to try to influence the decision of Kansas whether or not to be a free or slave state. There's going to be an election, a territorial election in Kansas, which will basically say, is Kansas going to be free or is it going to be slave? And so the Republicans decide, well, we're going to go down there and we're going to kind of pad the numbers, boost the numbers of the anti-slavery side before this election takes place. By the same token, there are hundreds and hundreds of people who travel into Kansas from neighboring Missouri, right? Kansas and Missouri share a border. And so lots of Missourians decide they're going to travel into Kansas to try to do the same thing on the opposite direction, right? They're going to try to boost those numbers of pro-slavery pro-slavery votes to try to push Kansas towards that. When the votes are counted, the pro-slavery faction wins what apparently is a massive landslide, right? 5,200 votes to not quite 800 votes for the Free Soilers, or for the anti-slavery side. Once Congress then gets these results, Congress analyzes them to validate that they're legitimate. Congress discovers that almost 5,000 of those pro-slavery ballots are fraudulent, right? That they have been written with the same people's handwriting and all kinds of really bald efforts at stuffing the ballot box. But instead of negating the vote, right? Instead of just saying, all right, well, we're going to do this over again because this election was fraudulent and illegal, Congress says, well, we don't know for sure how many of the Free Soil votes were fake, so we're going to go ahead and just let this result stand. So they're saying, the rule of law doesn't really matter here. We're going to just go ahead with whatever these results are and pretend that they're legitimate. This contributes to a period in Kansas's history that's known as Bleeding Kansas. Now, Bleeding Kansas is this kind of microcosm of the larger Civil War that is going to come along in 4 or 5 years. Bleeding Kansas is basically a civil war played out inside Kansas itself. One of the sparks that starts this whole thing is an attack that takes place on the floor of the U.S. Senate, where a Massachusetts senator named Charles Sumner, who's a Republican from Massachusetts, is beaten to within an inch of his life by a South Carolina representative named Preston Brooks. And the newspapers portray this as Charles Sumner, who was an abolitionist, which he was being beaten by this Southern firebrand, this violent, aggressive, sociopath, Preston Brooks, all because of Sumner's position on slavery. That's only partially the case. The attack was partially motivated because Brooks learned that in one of Sumner's speeches, Sumner made some very, very nasty and off-color kinds of remarks about Preston Brooks's uncle, who also happened to be a senator, right? And so Brooks was as much doing this to defend his family honor as he was in any kind of connection with the conversation or debate about slavery. But this violence on the floor of the U.S. Senate really starts to make people worry that the country is hurtling towards an even larger violent confrontation over the matter of slavery, the matter of how slavery impacts popular elections and the popular discourse and this kind of thing. So in Kansas in particular, you see two sides really start to congeal, where on the one side, free state supporters, they actually fortify the city of Lawrence, Kansas, and they write their own constitution, right? Now, mind you, Congress has said that the pro-slavery constitution, the pro-slavery side of Kansas, is the one that is quote-unquote official. And so these people are saying, we're going to create our own constitution for a free Kansas. We are going to barricade ourselves into Lawrence, the city of Lawrence, and we will start to run Kansas ourselves. The opposite side, the pro-slavery constitution, is drawn up by a faction in a city called Lecompton, which is not far from Lawrence, and they claim that they will operate as the legitimate official government of Kansas. The President of the United States, a guy named James Buchanan, he says, well, Congress supported the pro-slavery side, I will support the Lecompton Constitution. It ends up being then a period of about a year and a half to 2 years of, in some cases, really, really horrendous violence as the pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides in Kansas battle it out to determine which one will actually run the future of the territory and then the state. Eventually, Kansas manages to come out the other end after hundreds of people were killed with an anti-slavery, pro-freedom constitution. But it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of violence in the process. And that particular situation certainly doesn't bode well for the likelihood of the country sorting out how they're going to figure out whether to be a free or a slave nation, or, as it has been limping along for the decades previous, half and half, right? So Bleeding Kansas, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, are part of setting the stage for what are going to happen in the Civil War itself. One of the other events is going to be a Supreme Court case that actually gets resolved in 1857. And this case is going to be treated in one of the podcast's YouTube videos that you're going to be dealing with for the week. But I'll just give kind of a brief overview of it so that you can get into that with more detail there. Essentially, what happens is you have the family of a U.S. Army surgeon. And like military families today, this man and his family relocate around different parts of the country in the 1840s and 1850s. In the 1840s, the surgeon dies, and at that time the family is living in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a free state, right? It's one of those states, like I mentioned last time with Michigan, that according to the Northwest Ordinance from 1787, nobody would have slavery in any of the states coming out of that territory. So Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, right, part of Minnesota, none of those states could ever have slavery. So Dred Scott, one of the slaves of this surgeon, says, well, look, the surgeon dies, there's no clear will, right, it's contested, so I should be free, because we're in a free state, and, you know, slavery can't exist in the Northwest Territories, in Wisconsin, so I should be free. So he takes it to federal court, and it works its way through the federal court system to the point that it gets to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is under the jurisdiction of Chief Justice Roger Taney, and that person is the man on the left. And the court rules in a 7-2 decision that Dred Scott is not free, which that is what it is, right? That's a minor thing that wouldn't really have large ramifications beyond that. But Taney's decision goes further, and it says a couple of other more important kinds of considerations. One being that not only is Dred Scott free, but that African Americans, free or enslaved, have no rights according to the Constitution, right? They do not exist as citizens, they do not exist as, you know, people from a legislative or judicial standpoint. They are not something that the government needs to concern themselves with. They are strictly property. The other side of this is that since they are just property, the government cannot interfere in any way with the restriction of slavery's existence or expansion in any part of the country. Because constitutionally speaking, people's right to property is guaranteed. And that is something that applies everywhere in the United States. Essentially what Taney is saying is that slavery is guaranteed by the Constitution, and the only way that you can get rid of slavery is through a constitutional amendment. And this then is going to be one of the sort of lethal strokes to the idea that there can be some kind of compromise or some kind of solution, that we can figure out a way to let the country balance on this pivot of being half free and half slave. That's going away now. There's only going to be slavery guaranteed or slavery abolished. And so this is going to point directly to the possibility, increasingly likelihood, increasingly inevitability, of the country going to war with itself to try to sort that out. Ultimately, the only thing that officially, completely, and totally abolishes slavery is the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which goes into effect in December of 1865. It goes into effect about 8 months after the end of the American Civil War. And so the realization that that amendment was the only thing that would potentially, or not potentially, that would officially end slavery once and for all, that's part of where the Civil War comes from. The other sort of situation that will point directly to the early stages of the war is an event that is connected with a man named John Brown. And John Brown is also somebody that you will be dealing with in YouTube and podcast stuff. Brown was active in Bleeding, Kansas. He is was a minister, a Calvinist minister. Calvinism is a very fairly rigid form of Protestantism. He's from Connecticut, but he spends time in Ohio, actually, up around Stowe. And Brown is, well, he's crazy, without putting too fine a point on it. He's a psychopath. Brown is convinced that God has spoken to him directly, and that God has charged him with ending slavery, right? That Brown represents God's instrument on earth to get rid of slavery. And he says, you know what? Slavery is the worst institution in all of human history. It is the greatest evil to have plagued mankind since creation. And he says, fortunately, God has chosen me to make amends. But it's not going to be a simple process, right? Brown does not say, What we need to do is we need to get legislation to abolish slavery and then move on from there. Brown is convinced that God wants a vast amount of blood shed in the process of purging the sin of slavery, right? Basically, he says, there needs to be as much blood shed in the destruction of slavery as all of the blood that had been shed in the practice of slavery throughout history, right? So every example of violence that had ever taken place in any situation in the history of slavery, all of that blood, all of that violence would have to be washed away by an equal amount of blood and violence in destroying slavery as an institution. So Brown does a number of horrendously, supremely violent acts in the effort to achieve this or to bring this about. One of them, which is going to be the target or the focus of some of the stuff that you'll be doing through YouTube and through podcasts, is a raid that he organizes against the Federal Armory at a town called Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry today is in West Virginia. In 1859, when the raid happened, there was no West Virginia. West Virginia splits away from Virginia during the Civil War. So at the time when the raid happens, it's Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His idea, to kind of set the stage, is he plans to raid this armory, right, which is where you're storing weapons and ammunition, but it also happens to be one of the two places in the country that is authorized by the federal government to manufacture firearms for the U.S. military. And so Brown thinks, I'm going to take this armory, I'm going to arm and equip a slave army, and we will sweep through Appalachia and into the South, murdering and devastating the South along the way in order to abolish slavery, but also to achieve that abolition, that abolishment, through the sort of cleansing power of this massive bloodletting, this massive slaughter. The raid is a failure, but it's going to contribute another one of those, bricks in the wall towards the growing tension and growing distrust between northern and southern states, and increasingly between people in northern and southern states, that will ultimately kind of flare up during and after the election of 1860, and that will then be the straw that breaks the camel's back, as it were, leading to the American Civil War. So that's where we're going to pause here. Our next topic will be the Civil War. So make sure that you're checking out those podcasts, those YouTubes. Make sure that you're checking out the full PowerPoints on Blackboard. Make sure you're emailing me with questions. And that will be that. So I will see everybody on the flip side.